In this second part of our discussion of Gene Toomer's Cane, I want to talk in some detail about the work to discuss some of the core themes that emerge in the work and to sort of guide us in our reading and our thinking about the work. One of the things I mentioned in my earlier talk was that Toomer's casting of the South as a character is very important. We were talking about a dialectic triad or a triptych in the novel. The novel is constructed around um, the first section, which focuses on the South. The second section focuses on events in Washington D.C., which would be on the other side of the Mason-Dixie line. And then the third section is Kabnis, and Kabnis is a synthesis of the two things, and it tells a particular story that really reenacts what Toomer himself went through when he went to Sparta, Georgia, to teach, and it tells the experience of a teacher who eventually will become disillusioned and decide to leave. In some of the editions of the Norton, Cabinets is what is focused on. It's the excerpt that is there, and it's a good work to study carefully. And the things to look for in Cabinets would be, first of all, the characterization of the experience of somebody who is coming from a northern space and entering a southern space and trying to work through the meaning of that and the implications of that. There's a haunting sense of trauma that overhangs Capness, a sense of danger and violence at the same time, even as the characters are working through their emotional connections with each other and so on. But I thought what I could do is just frame this in some simple terms. And I think one of the more important sections, I think the section that is actually um, contains some of the most interesting work is in fact the first part of it, the part that is set in the South. Here are the characteristics, of course. One of them is that almost all the central characters, that is the protagonists, are women, um, and they range from Carintha, who is the first character in the first story. We watch her growing up, and we watch her sort of coming of age, but also watch her being a victim of abuse. She's a child, and there's a suggestion of a sexual kind of ownership of her, a kind of sexuality to her for a girl her age. And then we think of characters like Becky, a white woman who has two black sons, and the way she's ostracized and finds herself somehow in the middle of in the no man's land. At once shunned by blacks and at once shunned by whites, and of course her lover is somebody who comes in secretly to produce these children, and of course these black children grow up and their mother is white. Tuma is very interested in the downtrodden. Tuma is interested in the individual who, the ways in which blackness translates itself into a condition. Becky is essentially co opted by her circumstances into a black existence. And Tuma is making a very important point. His point is that a woman who becomes associated with a black person begins to be perceived and treated as a black person, and the fact that she produces black children deprives her of her privileges as a white woman, and essentially it demonstrates that the racism is not fundamentally about color, and about the phenotypes of race, but it's about the cultural construction, sociological construction, and a system of deprivation of black people so that it elevates and gives opportunity for whites. And Tuma is very, very sophisticated in his reading of it. We think of characters like Karma, Karma, the very strong woman, physically strong woman. So she stands out as well. And, as we see that story unfolding, Karma is the one who ends up being the one who resists any attempt at violence on her, and shows herself to be a powerful figure. And then we have somebody like Fern, and of course these names are really important. Fern is delicate. Fern is somebody who is, in a sense, jilted by her lover. Her somebody who is supposed to marry her. Fern is actually at a loss in this narrative. And we see in Fern, it's a very interesting story, a very curious way in which Toomer, the narrator, inserts himself in the work. And in inserting himself in the work, he does something quite important, I think, for the work. Near the end of it, he says, "You, dear reader, if you happen to be by that area in the south, you should go and look up my friend Fern." And it's clear that the dear reader that the narrator is talking to is male, um, and that's loaded in the implications about what Toomer is doing about female characters. So what is this fascination with the female? One of the things I hinted at the beginning was that Toomer was constructing the idea of the South as a woman. The South is embodied as a woman, and there are many ways in which you can read the novel as three characters, well, two characters really, coming together. There's a masculinity. Many of the characters in the Washington D.C. section are males. They're males dominate those stories. There are interesting relationships that happen, but we can see that it's from the point of view of the male that those stories are told. Whereas in the stories in the first half in the South, it's from the point of view of the woman. And so you can begin to see that there's a possibility that what we're actually dealing with is these two characters. The South is the woman, the North is the man, and they have this narrative of their tension and their co-joining and so on. They are black. I mean, there's no question about it. So it's not white, black, or anything like that. But the idea of the South as being a woman is very interesting because, of course, it suggests a number of things about the South. I think one of the interesting ways in which we see this is when we think of how the book begins. Carintha. In Carintha, there's a poem at the beginning of it. The poem goes, "Her skin is like dusk on the eastern horizon. Oh, can't you see it? Oh, can't you see it? Her skin is like dusk on the eastern horizon when the sun goes down." And listen to the first paragraph. "Men always wanted her, this Carintha, even as a child. Carintha carrying beauty, perfect as dusk when the sun goes down. Old men rode her hobby horse upon their knees. Young men danced with her at frolics when they should have been dancing with their grown-up girls. God grant us youth," secretly prayed the old man. The young fellows counted the time to pass before she would be old enough to mate with them. This interest of the male, who wishes to ripen a growing thing too soon, could mean no good for her. And of course, at the end of the relatively short story, in the middle of it, we get that repetition. Her skin is like dusk. Oh, can't you see it? Her skin is like dusk when the sun goes down. How does a piece, it's worth looking at the way that a piece ends. There's the refrain now. Carintha is a woman, men do not know that the soul of her was a growing thing ripened too soon. They'll bring their money, they will die not having found it out. Carintha at 20, carrying beauty perfect as dusk when the sun goes down. Carintha. Her skin is like dusk on the eastern horizon. Oh, can't you see it? Oh, can't you see it? Her skin is like dusk on the eastern horizon when the sun goes down. Goes down. So of course the story, inside the story, we get that moment where she is the victim of a certain kind of abuse, and she's also suggested as a kind of prostitute. So if we are thinking of but there's a clear relationship that Toomer is trying to build between the body of the woman and the body of the South, the physical body of the South. Um, and in those poetic refrains, her skin becomes the skin of the South, her body becomes the body of the South, and this is a recurring thing that comes through. It's a theme that comes through, especially in the poems. Here's a poem called Face. Hair silver gray like streams of stars, brows recurved canoes, quivered by the ripples blown by pain, her eyes mist of tears condensing on the flesh below, and her channeled muscles are cluster grapes of sorrow, purple in the evening sun, nearly ripe for worms. Again, the physical body and the physical landscape are connected, and this is the body of the woman. Um, and we get this recurring all the way through. At the beginning of Karma, um, the story is going to take us into the cane fields. In fact, Karma could be called Cane. The story takes us into the cane fields where this incredible act of violence takes place, and the refrain of the story: "Wind is in the cane, come along." Cane leaves swaying, rusty with talk, scratching choruses above the guinea squawk. Wind is in the cane, come along. Um, it's very interesting that it's Karma who goes out there. Look at the end of that story. Slowly, then, like a flash, Bane came to know that the shot she fired with averted head was aimed to whistle like a dying hornet through the cane. Twice deceived, and one deception proved the other. His head went off, slashed one of the men who helped, the man who stumbled over her. Now he's in the gang. Who was her husband? Should she not take others, this Karma, strong as a man, whose tale, as I have told it, is the crudest melodrama, is the way that the piece ends. And of course, when they say he's in the gang, it means he's in the chain gang and he's gone to jail. And he's gone to jail out of his jealousy and anger. And of course, Karma is justified in her choices, her sexual choices. Toomer's characters, therefore, the women, tend to be sexually um, aggressive. They tend to be um, they tend to be defined by their sexuality. They tend to be defined by their bodies and what their bodies can do and the ways in which they control men's desires and men's needs and what men want. Yet one of the things that you'll find, and I think it's a very telling thing, that when we get into the second part, the DC section, there's a lot of attention to the internal thoughts of characters, especially the internal thoughts of men. But with the first section, whether it's Becky, whether it's Karma, whether it's Carintha, whether it's Fern, we are kept outside of their minds. The women are just the bodies observed. They take action and they do things, but the narrator doesn't seem capable of entering into the imagination and the thinking or even the rationale of the women. And the women act in ways that are mysterious, and the poem sort of elevates this idea. The stories elevates this idea. And it's a very telling thing. I think it's very important to keep that in mind, because in many ways it demonstrates one of the things that one could argue about Jean Toomer's treatment of women, because while his stories elevate women, centralize women in the narrative, in a sense, the women remain inscrutable. The women remain mysteries. The women's motivations and actions remain mysterious or questionable, or the cause for complication and trauma. And in a sense, that elevates, or that actually reinforces arguably a sexist perception of women. a perception of women that means that they just cannot be understood. Women will just behave in a strange way, and of course this may have been Toomer's sort of holding perspective, but I want to suggest that it's worth sort of noting that that Toomer's portrayal of women is driven and guided from the male perspective, and driven and guided from the sensibility of a male. I think this is something that I would want us to pay attention to, and I hope you would look at it and pay attention to it as you're reading these works, because while they are sympathetic to women, and while the male characters are despicable in many ways, or unfair in many ways, there is still a sense in which the author, the narrator, that is Gene Toomer himself, seems perplexed by women, and that perplexity is not a celebration of a woman's strength, but a celebration of her sort of peculiar, irrational, an irrational and impossible to understand sensibility, which then becomes a kind of stereotype of the female, and it's worth paying attention to. I want to sort of look. One of the things to look at is the story Fern, which is one in which there's a narrator, and that's a first person narrator, and the first person narrator actually comes into the piece, and it's a male. And in the moment in the story, it says, "One evening I walked up the pike on purpose and stopped to say hello," meaning to say hello to Fern. "Some of her family were about, but they moved away to make room for me. Damn if I knew how to begin. Would you, Mr. and Mrs. So and so people, the weather, the crops, the new preacher, the frolic, the church benefit, rabbit and possums hunting, and the new soft drink they had at Old Pap's store, the schedule of the trains, what kind of town Macon was, Negroes, migration, north, boll weevils, syrup, the Bible. To all these things she gave a yes sir or no sir without further comment." So this is Fern. He's talking about all sorts of subjects, the male guy, and all she has is yes sir or no sir and no comment. I began to wonder if perhaps my own emotional sensibility had played one of its tricks on me. "Let's take a walk," I at last ventured. The suggestion coming after so long an isolation was novel enough, I guess, to surprise, but it wasn't that. Something told me that men before me had said just that as a prelude to the offering of their bodies. I tried to tell her with my eyes. I think she understood. The thing from her that made my throat catch vanished. Its passing left her visible in a way I had thought but never seen. We walked down the pike with people on all the porches gaping at us. Doesn't it make you mad? She meant the row of petty gossiping people. She meant the world. Through a canebrake that was ripe for cotton, the branch was reached under a sweet gum tree, and where reddish leaves had dammed the creek a little, we sat down. Dusk suggesting the almost imperceptible procession of giant trees settled with a purple haze about the cane. I felt strange, as I always do in Georgia, particularly at dusk. I felt that things unseen to men were tangibly immediate. It would not have surprised me had I had a vision. People have them in Georgia more often than you would suppose. A black woman once saw the Mother of Christ and drew her in the charcoal on the courthouse wall. When one is on the soil of one's ancestors, most anything can come to one. And so this is the encounter, and here's how the story ends. They meet. She sings she's singing a song in a child's voice, and so on, but nothing actually happens. But here's the last paragraph. There was talk about her fainting with me in the cane field. and I got one or two ugly looks from town men who set themselves up to protect her. In fact, there was talk of making me leave town, but they never did. They kept a watch out for me, though, shortly after I came back north. From the train window, I saw her as I crossed her road, saw her on her porch, head tilted a little forward where the nail was, eyes vaguely focused on the sunset. Saw her face flow into them, the countryside, and something that I call God flowing into them. Nothing ever really happened. Nothing ever came to Fern, not even I. Something I could do for her, some fine or named thing. And then here's the moment. He says, and friend, you, she's still living. I have reason to know. Her name against the chance that you might happen down that way is Fernie Mae Rosen. That's how the story ends. Of course, one of the things I've been trying to say is the ways in which we have this in-depth look at this man who has feelings for Fern, is thinking maybe he'll seduce her and so on, so on, but she's completely inscrutable, and yet she dominates him. And one would see this as a kind of female power, but it's a female power that emasculates the man, and that leaves the man feeling completely helpless and so on. But it's a complete stereotype, a stereotype of a Southern black woman as an unknowable figure. It'll be interesting to think about, and it might be a good essay to think about, is to compare Zora Neale Hurston's Sweat and her portrayal of Delia, how she enters into the mind of Delia, and how Delia's motivations and actions are explicitly explained as logical and reasonable when set against the characters that we see in something like Fern. It will be a very interesting comparison when we think about it. And what is the fundamental difference? One is written by a woman who has decided to write a Southern woman, but with a woman with her own way of thinking and her own sense of agency. And then the other is written by a man about a similar kind of woman, but seen from the perspective of a male, and therefore seen as a perspective of a character that has no agency and is inscrutable and almost pitiful. I think there's great promise in that comparison. So, number of things to do with thinking about Cain is to think about form. What is the effect of using different forms? What is the effect of using poems, for instance, if we talk about some of the poems? The other thing is that throughout in the middle section, there are dramas where it's all dialogue, strictly dialogue, and he's using these forms as well. And then finally, the thing to look at is gender and the relationships that are established and the portrayal of women, the construction of women and the construction of women, of their understanding of them. I said finally, but I take that back. The true final one is the portrayal of the South. What is the South like? It is clear that the South is beautiful. He sees it as physically beautiful. And throughout, he's talking about the pine trees, he's talking about the sky, he's talking about the warmth and the heat and so on and so forth. But it is a place where nothing progresses. There's no progress. It's entirely agrarian. And none of the characters seem to be making any kinds of progress in society and social development and so on and so forth. And therefore, there is a way in which if we read this as Toomer's understanding of what the South is, it would not be a particularly elevating and exciting one. But it's worth looking at and paying attention to. So that's the end of it. Gene Toomer's Cain.